Today's unemployment figures show the economy is moving in the right direction. The drop in unemployment is one more sign that the economy is strengthening.
Muckrake holds journalists accountable. So Sanders proposes a new deal for journalism to ensure media serves public interests. Appearing on Face the Nation on CBS Sunday, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders discussed a number of issues he covered in his upcoming book, It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, including his proposal to ensure the news media acts in the interest of the general public and not wealthy corporations and powerful interest groups. Margaret Brennan described his proposal as a new deal for journalism. As some European countries do, the Vermont independent senator said the U.S. should have nonpartisan public funding of media to ensure local news outlets can stay afloat and keep communities informed about their city council, their school board. Such a system would also prevent news networks like CBS from relying on advertising dollars, which Medicare for All advocates have blamed for playing a role in the corporate media's hostility towards a nationalized healthcare system and other progressive proposals for the public good. What I say in this book is that, look, I've done 1,000 interviews like I'm doing with you right now, says Sanders, and nobody has ever come up to me, not one reporter, not you, not anybody else, and said, Bernie, why are you spending twice as much on health care as any other country, and yet we have 85 million uninsured or underinsured? How many programs that CBS, NBC, ABC had on why we have a dysfunctional healthcare system? Does that have anything to do with who owns the major networks? Bernie, what are you going to do about income and wealth inequality? Why are billionaires paying an effective tax rate lower than working class people? No one asked me those questions. I think he was on PBS as well. They didn't ask him about the military-industrial complex either. As Luke Salvage reported at Jacobin following the 2020 presidential election, viewers of the Democratic primary debates weren't informed by moderators that Medicare for All was supported by a majority of Americans, and ad breaks featured health insurance and pharmaceutical companies seizing every opportunity to bombard viewers with misleading industry agitprop about the breathtaking wonders of profit-driven health care. He added, CNN's Detroit debate is a case in point. The network was demanding at least $300,000 from companies advertising with a single 30-second spot, costing an estimated $110,000 in groups like the so-called Partnership for America's Healthcare Future and Practice, a front for various corporate interests, filled out many of the slots, regardless of how anchors or hosts think about an issue like healthcare. The network's basic model essentially precludes meaningful critique of the status quo by design. As long as it persists, don't expect to see the public interest or popular opinion reflected anywhere in cable TV. To counter that dynamic, Sanders argued on Face the Nation a new deal for journalism included publicly funded media is an idea that we should explore. In the interview, the senator spoke about his support for attaching some strings to U.S. funding for Israel to help pressure the country to end its human rights abuses against Palestinians. Sanders, who reiterated his call for the Democratic Party to focus on representing the interests of all working people. What we need to do is have a movement of workers, Latino workers, all types of workers, and understand that we're all in this together, said Sanders. I don't care if you're living in rural Iowa, where I spend a lot of time. All right, you can afford health care. You can't afford to send your kid to college. Or you're living in San Francisco. So too often we forget about the economic issues that unite us. The vast majority of the people know that the pharmaceutical industry is ripping us off. The vast majority of the people understand that we have to improve our educational system. Let's work on that. And from commondreams.org, Sanders proposes new deal for journalism to ensure media serves public interests. Nonpartisan, publicly funded media is an idea that we should explore, said the senator. Appearing on Face the Nation on CBS Sunday, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders discussed a number of issues he covers in his upcoming book, It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, including his proposal to ensure the news media acts in the interests of the general public and not wealthy corporations and powerful interest groups. Host Margaret Brennan described his proposal as a new deal for journalism. As some European countries do, the Vermont independent senator said the U.S. should have nonpartisan public funding of media to ensure local news outlets can stay afloat and keep communities informed about their city council, their school board. Such a system would also prevent news networks like CBS from relying on advertising dollars, which Medicare for All advocates have blamed for playing a role in the corporate media's hostility towards a nationalized healthcare system and other progressive proposals for the public good. What I say in the book is that, look, I've done 1,000 interviews like I'm doing with you right now, Sanders told Brennan, And nobody has ever come to me, not one reporter, not you, not anybody else, and said, Bernie, why are you spending twice as much on health care as many other countries, and yet we have 85 million uninsured or underinsured? As Luke Savage reported at Jacobin following the 2020 presidential election, viewers of the Democratic primary debates weren't informed by moderators that Medicare for All was supported by a majority of Americans. We read that. And see, VermontBiz.com, the urgent need to rebuild and protect journalism. U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders today in America, after decades of consolidation and deregulation, some 8 multinational media companies control almost all the news you watch, read, hear, and download. All across the country, corporate conglomerates and hedge fund vultures have bought and consolidated local newspapers and slashed their newsrooms, all while giving executives and shareholders big payouts. The result of this trend has been the dissemination of journalism. The result of this trend is more than 1,400 communities across the country losing local newspapers, which are also outlets for local TV, radio, and digital sites that rely on them for reporting. The result of this trend is ad networks lining up for billions of dollars a year in pharmaceutical and oil ads, while failing to provide a consistently fair hearing for issues like Medicare for All or downplaying coverage of the climate crisis. The result of this trend is that, according to one study published by Spotlight on Poverty at Opportunity, a nonpartisan forum, despite millions of Americans struggling to survive budget-strapped newsrooms, have not turned their attention to poverty. In other words, at precisely the moment we need more reporters covering the healthcare crisis, the climate emergency, and economic inequality, the corporate media is incentivized to ignore or downplay these critical issues. The American people desperately need high-quality journalism. I believe that's why most reporters and newspaper staff get into this work. I'm not talking about the ones that are paid millions of dollars to pontificate about frivolous political gossip, but the ones who, in the words of Joseph Pulitzer, undertake the painstaking reporting that will fight for progress and reform, never tolerate injustice or corruption, and always fight demagogues. When we've read real journalism, we've seen crimes like Watergate exposed and confronted. When we've lacked real journalism, we have seen crimes like mortgage fraud go unnoticed and unpunished, leading to a devastating financial crisis that destroyed millions of American lives. I bring this up today because New York Times journalists and staff are currently attempting to bargain for a fair contract with management at the paper, but have not been met with good faith. The staff at the NY Times are fighting for a living wage and fair pay, something that's not so radical when the company just approved $150 million in stock buybacks for its investors. Real journalism requires significant resources, and one reason we do not have enough real journalism in America right now is because far too many media outlets are led primarily by the pursuit of profit, as opposed to investing in the workers and resources it takes to educate the people of this country and hold the powerful accountable. It's long past time in this country to reinstate and strengthen media ownership relationships or rules. It's long past time we limit the number of stations that large broadcasting corporations can own in each market and nationwide. It's long past time in this country that we prevent tech giants like Facebook and Google from using their enormous market power to cannibalize and defund news organizations, especially the small and independent ones without the infrastructure to fight back. And it's long past time in this country that we explore new ways to empower media workers to effectively collectively bargain with large corporations like the NY Times. Our Constitution's First Amendment explicitly protects the free press because the founders understood how important journalism is to a democracy. Quality journalism is not possible when media workers are unable to earn a living wage and when corporations prioritize profit above all else. We need to rebuild and protect a diverse and truly independent press so that real journalists and media workers can do the critical jobs that they love and that a functioning democracy requires. And solidarity, Bernie Sanders. And here's Bernie at Face the Nation.
Also talk about a new deal for journalism and rethinking of the role of public and community media in the United States. You're very harsh on the media, as we talked about, including, you mentioned this network, you mentioned Washington Post, you do.
Didn't I say all kinds of nice things about you?
No, some other journalists here. You did give a shout out to Kara Corte and some other reporters, but you say you take direct aim at the media for not asking the questions that you think need to be asked. How do you, on this New Deal idea, how can you have the U.S. government in any way involved with the media and direct funding when trust in the government is so low in this country and trust in media is low?
Okay, two separate issues. Number one, what I say in the book is that, look, I have done 1,000 interviews like I'm doing with you right now. And nobody has ever come up to me, not one reporter, not you, not anybody else, that said, Bernie, why are we spending twice as much on healthcare as any other country, and yet we have 85 million uninsured or uninsured? How many programs have CBS, NBC, ABC had on why we have a dysfunctional healthcare system? Does that have anything to do with who owns the major networks? Bernie, what are you going to do about income and wealth inequality? Do you demand, why are billionaires paying an effective tax rate lower than working class people? No one asked me those questions. Okay.
No one tells us the questions to ask.
I understand that, but there's a culture in the media. No one tells people who work for me not to vote for Donald Trump. Surely, I will guarantee you they don't. I never tell them to do it. But then there's another issue, and that is a totally different issue. We are seeing media deserts in this country. Local newspapers are going out of business. So people get no news from their city council, their school board.
Real issue.
How do you deal with that? And the reason they're going out of business is private sector companies can't make money anymore because of the radical transformation of media. What happens? Do people not know what's going on in their city? How do you deal with that? Well, in European countries, what they do is they do it through a non-partisan public funding of media. I think that's an idea that we should explore.
So I'm told we're running out of time. But
I'm just getting warmed up, Margaret. Have the fun.
And here's Russell Brand with Seymour Hersh.
Stay free with Russell. Stay free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.
We're speaking to Seymour Hersh because of his recent Substack article on the US involvement in the Nord Stream pipeline, which of course suggests that the US involvement was contrary to their very public denial, and even why the denial itself was significant in avoiding congressional permission. It's a fantastic piece of writing from a prize-winning journalist. It's an honor to have you, Seymour. Thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here, I think. Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
What's your hat?
It's probably attention-seeking on some level, Seymour. I've come from the world of entertainment, probably haven't entirely let go of the idea that I'm a sort of a physical representation of the radical stance that I take in my own journalism, one journalist to another.
I don't know if the word radical is the right one, but we'll let that one stand.
You want me to take the hat off, because I'll do it out of respect for you and your prize.
I don't want to see what's there, but I will tell you something. I was fascinated, as I told one of your aides just a minute ago, by the Condoleezza Rice quote, and my pay for this performance here will be. Somebody send me a link to that.
We will send that to you.
It's you're ahead of the curve with that idea, but that's been a prominent theme in the American conversations about oil. And it is a fact that Norway, which did help us, has more than doubled the amount of oil, natural gas rather, is shipping now to Western Europe. It had about 9 or 10%. It's way up. And so you can never cut out mercantile interests. But there were probably much more immediate interests, the war in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a fascinating point that you were making. Anyway, so I got something out of this. So I'm happy.
Look, can you stop being so generally cynical about my hat and the entire experience of this interview? I got something out of it. You don't need to overplay I'm a well-worn journalist, I was around during Watergate, I've got a Pulitzer Prize. I get it. You're senior, you're world-weary, you've become cynical about establishment power.
No. It's much more ephemeral than that. It's just, it's amusing. The hat is amusing. I don't think there's anything profound in me talking about it. It's what I see.
Sir, firstly, I will credit Gareth, who makes the show with me, for his research that led to our use of the Condoleezza Rice clip. And our general approach is to challenge the dominant narrative that we are given through mainstream media, which once was the domain of ordinary investigative media, which seems to have become deeply sanitized in the last 20, 30 years. Increasingly, we're seeing, whether it's Chris Hedges or Glenn Greenwald or yourself, journalists that have been prized for their investigative work being, if not demonized, certainly subject to something amounting to smears. The White House has already denied your story, and I'd like to ask you what you think has happened to journalism in the last 20 or 30 years, and why we are not presented with complex narratives that undergird reporting with the kind of economic, financial, military and geopolitical interests that usually lead to events like the Ukraine-Russia conflict, or indeed an event, sort of broadly speaking, within the remit of that narrative, like the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage.
Well, I think one of the problems, look, you're asking, you're throwing the ball to me. This is all I brood about a lot, because I worked at the New York Times in the 70s and had a great time, was never sort of blocked from writing stuff. And it's a different world now. Oh, come on, stop it. But anyway, the bottom line is that I think what a secret source now is for the people, many of the people who write for the major newspapers, is a press secretary who, says, come over here, I'll tell you something a little different than I've told the other guys. I just don't understand why they're not jumping on certain stories. Certainly this story is, I can just tell you, a friend of mine, I have a wonderful old friend who escaped from the Middle East, became an oil man, became very rich and very happy, living in France now. He wrote me after the story, and he said, oh, Cy, he said, my nickname, he said, you have become a master in the deconstruction of the obvious. I mean, what was so hard about this story? We know Russia didn't do it, because if they wanted to, they could turn a valve. And so I guess, is Macedonia a member of the NATO? Maybe they did it. Where do you go for the next possible suspect? Who is it? It's purely us, since the president basically said it. But the bigger question is, what's going on with journalism? I don't know. My old newspaper, the New York Times, for which I did all sorts of stuff on the CIA and Watergate and Vietnam for them, hasn't touched the story. Neither has the Washington Post, which is the two great main sheets. I don't think the Wall Street Journal has. The rest of the country, some people have. It's just like a blank. It's like, it could be as simple as this. We're coming off the Trump years, and we make big divisions in the media. We're either going to be for or against Trump. It could be the same sort of dichotomy plays out. We're now in the Trump corner. And if we write something critical of we're now in the Biden corner, rather. If we publish something critical of Biden, we might be leading ourselves open to more Republicans. The guy in Florida, et cetera, DeSantis. I don't know what the fear is, but it can't just be about the fact that I don't name sources. I spent 9 years at the New York Times writing about the CIA going after Allende and going and all that stuff, killing people abroad without naming sources. I mean, either trust what I do or you don't.
Yes. I know that you also wrote about Abu Ghraib, significant revelations there, and about the mass murders in Vietnam of civilians. And the banalization of the media space is a theme that we touch upon frequently, the infantilization of us as the audience class. Even with the current escalation of tensions between the USA and China through the sanctions around semiconductors, and of course the rather more visually stimulating and sensational story that accompanies the balloon, and indeed the shooting down of the balloon.
Can I tell you about the balloons? Can I tell you a little bit about the balloons?
Yeah.
I asked somebody about it. I have friends, and I said, well, what's going on with the balloons? Of course, they've been there forever. Maybe you could argue they could take the next couple of weeks. And we've put about I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars into a new fighter, the F-22, that's coming online. We had one called the F-1, painted a balloon on the side of his fuselage. we're going to show you we belong. Willy Brandt did do that. He got that started for all of his faults. And so in 1990, when they joined, Gorbachev agreed to let this unified Germany into NATO, and the price was a commitment by us in writing that I live in Washington, so I know people. I have a friend that has access to the classified part of the embassy, our embassy in Bonn, and he went and read the cables for me. There's nothing fantastic about it. The language used by our Secretary of State, James Baker, was the equivalent in the documents. The agreement we made with the Gorbachev, it wasn't a treaty, but it was an understanding, not 1 inch. We will not go 1 inch east. And then NATO initially was 19 when it was set up in 49 rather. It's now what, about 170 countries, Macedonia, stuff like that. I'm exaggerating. Well, NATO is a far cry from it's not Europe anymore. It's all over. I don't know. Maybe one of the tropical islands in the South Pacific will become a member of NATO next. And so here's the Russians eating this. Here's Putin eating this. And then we start putting missiles on the border in Poland that we claim are defensive, but in a half a day it can be turned into offensive weapons. There's no question about that. It's a fact. It can be just diverted. It'll take some time, a half a day, but you can fire your 7 minutes from Moscow. And that's another reality. So it's what I hate to see in the paper, in my newspaper, for example, they keep on describing the Russian attack as being without provocation, unprovoked. Well, it was really provoked. I'm very troubled by my president and his immediate foreign national security team, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Victoria Nuland, whose husband is one of the leading neocons who got us helped convince Dick Cheney to go into that the solution to 9/11 and Al Qaeda was to attack Iraq. one of the great non-existence relation. I mean, just so crazy. But anyway, those three, I call them Winkin, Blinken, and Nod. I don't know if you have that child story there, but we have it in our country. The first thing they do is they meet in the Secretary of State in Alaska with the Chinese to start telling the Chinese what to do about their own domestic problems. And now we push the war. I don't know things, but I know things. The initial agreement, the initial decision to plan for the pipeline was an option for leverage for the president against Putin. It was started a year ago, 13 months ago in December, and it bled over to early this year. And the idea was to ask the community for ideas. I wrote about this, whether kinetic or non-kinetic, and the word was kinetic. That means we're going to hurt somebody. And so, of course, it emerged, we're going to take out the pipelines. We've been complaining about the pipelines for a dozen years. The first one, Nord Stream 1, and the new one. The new pipeline is interesting because the first one was cut off by Russia. The second one was cut off by the Germans. They put a sanction on it. So Germany always had the option of opening up the pipeline anytime it wanted. And who cares about the pipeline in summer, but comes fall, comes winter, and that's when you're going to need it. The Russian natural gas has been supplying Germany and Western Europe with cheap gas for a dozen years, and the economy's boomed based on cheap gas. Now Europe's suffering. It's getting cold. They had a mild winter, but it's getting very cold now. The leading companies are all getting, the price of gas is going up enormously. Companies like BASF, which is the largest chemical company in Germany in the world, has been talking to China about maybe moving some assets there. The consequences of knocking out the pipeline economically are disastrous. As you said, Norway's getting more gas, and Norway was a big player in us with the project. But the key thing is, when the president told the intelligence community, I want to see if I have an option. I think the thought of, in my understanding, was the thought of the community was, we're going to do what the president wants. That's the whole idea of having a CIA. I mean, if you're the president of the United States right now, this guy can't get a thing through Congress. But tomorrow, if he wants to, he can take a walk in the Rose Garden with the CIA director, and somebody can get hurt the next day. That makes you feel pretty good, particularly if you can't have your way anywhere else. And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think the CIA is a very dangerous community, but full of a lot of smart people. Anyway, it was always to be an option. And what happened is, he didn't exercise it. They were going to do it at one point when they had cover in the summer. They had cover because of there was a big. The Baltic Sea is not there's no oil there, and the idea of having a bunch of deep sea divers start digging around would have been exposed any problem, any thought of getting away with taking out the pipelines. It just would have been too obvious, too seen. But there was an exercise, NATO exercise last summer. There's been one every summer for 22 years now in the Baltic, and then maybe you could slide it in then. That was the idea. But the president didn't pull a whistle then. In late September, he did it. And by that time, the community itself had thought there was no reason to do it anymore. You know, it was there as a potential threat, but he'd already started the war. And by September, the one thing that was interesting, I've always been among a group of journalists and people in the community who have been very skeptical about the chances of Ukraine to win a war against Russia. And, you know, if you know the history, when in Stalingrad, when the Germans got their great defeat, the Russians were losing 2,400 dead and wounded every 4 hours in the final days of the battle, and one just kept on going. I mean, they are tough. And so far in the war against Ukraine, I'm sure in the beginning it's correct that Putin or his generals underestimated the willingness of the Ukrainians to commit hara-kiri, as they have been. But by September, it was clear there was real trouble. Among other things, the corruption was so wild among the top, even including Zelensky. They're all fighting for what percentage of the money they're going to steal. There's a lot of fighting and brooding about that, even today. And so it was a corrupt regime. It never was going to be accepted in the NATO, and it wasn't going to win the war. And so Joe, then in late September, wants to hit, and he gets it. And at that point, I think that there were people in the intelligence community who thought it was, at that point, that didn't make sense. That was just crazy. And what's he doing? He's throwing in, for whatever he can. The fear he had was that since Germany controlled the new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, the one that was just built and was just stopped, they just finished it in 2020. And it was full of gas even then. The gas that came up it's a 750-mile pipeline from Germany all the way to near St. Petersburg right up near Estonia, the border with Russia and Estonia.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Yeah, so the long pipeline was full of methane gas. That's what the gas is, methane. And anyway, and that's what bubbled up. It wasn't pumping any. It just stored there. It would have been perfectly safe. And so I guess that the Biden's thought was, I want to keep any possibility that the Germans and the Western and what the rest of the Western Union which is going to start getting cold. He did it in late September. Will open up the pipeline and then be at the mercy of Russia. In other words, the way they put it. That pipeline, the Russian gas, was a weapon for the Russians, a weapon. And once you took away that weapon, West Germany, if West Germany cannot open up the pipeline anymore, and Germany rather, and the European allies of NATO, well, then they'll keep on supporting us in the war. They won't have the option of saying we quit. We'd rather have Russian gas than join you in a war that you can't win. And that's what I think the dominant thinking was.
Yes, I think you're right that the US were incentivized by the suggestion that it created the opportunity and necessity, in fact, for harmony between Russia and Europe. It created conditions that were not advantageous that meant that solutions became evident and suggestible. It was interesting that you touched upon Ukrainian corruption and the current clear out that Zelensky enacted, even though in reporting from The Guardian prior to this conflict, of course, when The Guardian's perspective on Ukraine was radically different and much less simplistic and reductive, they talked about Zelensky's ownership or previous ownership of offshore. To speak with you with your evidence, like the New York digital. Did you have a better time than you thought you would have?
Your gas is a lot more expensive than my gas, but you also create gas. You're good at creating gas yourself. You're a good gas machine. That's great.
All they need to do is fit a pipeline to.
And so there we have it. So watch this space and remember that your engagement through a like, a share, subscribe will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Watch this space. We'll be right back.